everyone. I'm happy to be asked to participate in this DCASE conference. Thank you to the organizers. Today I will be reviewing the human ability to recognize everyday sound events. Many of the issues I bring up will have parallels with issues that arise during your work on detection and classification of acoustic scenes and events. I hope that you will find it useful to explore these connections. The human ability to recognize sounds is crucial for being aware of events in our surroundings. There are some ways in which our auditory recognition system is robust and powerful, but there are other ways in which it can be malleable and easily fooled. We'll begin by talking about ways to ensure that you are working with quality human data. I first want to take a step back and marvel at what an amazing thing it is that we do when we hear everyday sounds and know what is causing them. We can do much of this with even one ear. So let's start with an analogy, a single post standing up in this lake. If you were only able to measure the level of the water on this post at each moment in time, do you think you could know that an object was passing by? Could you tell that it was a boat? What about the fact that the level of the water is also influenced by all of the other objects around, each of which could be causing new waves or reflecting waves? Do you think that you could also tell that there was a duck or a swimmer nearby? That's essentially the problem that is posed to our ear. Sound sources emit energy which causes variation in air pressure. These pressure variations propagate outwards, analogous to the waves of water in this photo. All of the waves in the air sum when they meet each other. The initial perceptual information we have is the instantaneous deflection of our tympanic membrane, or eardrum, in response to air pressure. It registers only one value at a given point in time. We derive all meaning from sound by the precise pattern in which this amplitude of this deflection varies over time. Yet we can recognize multiple sound sources in our environment with apparent ease. This apparent ease belies the difficulty of the inferences we are making. This is not solved by the ear alone. It is accomplished with the help of the entire auditory system and human knowledge. So how do we find out about human sound recognition? We have to start by asking people questions. And it very much matters how you ask them the question. This is relevant to sound event classification systems because they are optimized to accurately predict human labels, and human recognition data are often used as a benchmark for sound event classification system performance. If you use a free response paradigm, for example, asking listeners something like, "What is this sound?" the responses are not constrained, but there's a great deal of work on the other end for the experimenter, who must decide if two responses that are different words actually mean the same sound event. So they must code and quantify data consistently. You can give a forced choice, for example, is this a truck or a cow? And then your coding is easy, but the accuracy of the answers you get will be constrained by how well you've chosen your response options. Another option is a rating scale, such as the scale on the right for loudness. It is unidimensional and it gives you much richer information than a yes-no response, but responses will be affected by its maximum value and by how willing people are to use the entire scale. Or you can use this scale on the left, a semantic differential scale, which puts words with opposite meanings on either end of the scale. For example, with this ratings for guitar sound quality, you'll have something like rough versus smooth. Obviously, the semantics of these words must be agreed upon by all participants. In the middle, we see a depiction of a sorting task. And this is well suited to find out how people explicitly organize a large number of stimuli into concepts or sound categories. This can be done in a free sorting format, but it is simpler to make conclusions if the categories are predefined, such as sort these sounds into whether they belong in a kitchen or a park. Finally, in order to have quality data, it's going to depend on how you handle the individual differences between raters. You're going to use an inter-rater agreement criterion, such as kappa or interclass correlation coefficient. It depends on the type of rating being done. Also, you're going to have to make decisions on whether or not to normalize when people do not use the full scale, and decide whether the number of observations is sufficient to have the reliability that you need to find the effects that you want to discover. Data cleaning practices should report all data that were discarded and use a clear and consistent criterion for doing that. The best method for discarding data from non-compliant participants is to use catch trials or find some other criterion that is not related to your question of interest. You'll also want to think about the culture that your participants are coming from and be sure that they understand the words in something like a semantic differential scale, that they understand those words the same way that you intend them. Also, sound familiarity has a big effect on sound recognition ability, and if someone has never heard a pig squeal before, maybe that sound should not be on your test. Also, I have seen research showing that using a linear scale from left to right is not always the best option. In some cultures, the use of a rating scale on a circular knob can result in participants using a broader range of the rating scale. So just think about issues like that. And also, the answers that you get will also depend on the memory load of the task, which has to do with how complicated the instructions are and how many items they have to juggle in memory while making their comparisons. It will also depend on how much information people have about the type of setting or scene that they're listening in. For example, if you hear a clang and you know you're listening to a kitchen, that will constrain the types of events and objects that you consider. To use some lingo, people use priors. And as we'll visit later, it will depend on what you guide people to listen for, such as source, object, or sound quality. You've probably heard the question, if a tree falls in a forest, does it make a sound? Well, in this question, it's really essential to specify that the tree falls, right? It has to be an action in order for there to be a sound. It would be sort of a nonsensical puzzle if somebody asked you, if a tree is in a forest, does it make a sound? If there's a different action, like a tree sways in the breeze, that would be a very different type of sound. So this is what we mean when we talk about a sound event. We have to talk about the forces, the actions, and the objects that are generating the sound. That's why we're always talking about both of those things. And it also suggests that using both nouns and verbs in audio databases for labeling is beneficial. We now explore the robustness of human environmental sound recognition. Environmental sounds can be defined as all naturally occurring sounds that are neither speech nor music. It is worth noting here that both human speech and human music are robustly recognized, and they are forms of communication. So speech is subjected to selective pressure in order to be understood by humans. On the other hand, there is no such force consistently shaping non-communicative environmental sounds to make them better understood by humans. In other words, there's no guarantee that we're going to recognize any environmental sounds, but of course there is selective pressure for hearing to provide humans with information about their environment, and it does that. It turns out that sound recognition is rather good for common everyday sounds. When spectral information about environmental sounds is degraded with noise, recognition accuracy remains high for many sounds, and this is especially true with a characteristic temporal pattern, such as typing at a keyboard. Now, I'm going to play you some examples of environmental sounds that have been degraded by being processed through a process known as vocoding. This process disrupts the spectrum or frequency content of the sound, but it preserves most of its temporal characteristics. In the first example I'll play, the temporal envelope of a common environmental sound has been used to modulate noise that's in 4 separate frequency channels. Although in a clinical setting you would typically be given some options to choose from to identify the sound, right now I will just ask you the open-ended question, what do you think this sound is? Do you have a guess? All right, I'll give you another chance because now you're going to hear that same sound, but it was modulated with the same temporal envelope with sine waves in the 4 spectral regions instead of noise. Do you think you know what it is? All right, let's play the original sound. I hope that you got that it was a dog barking. I also want to point out that sound recognition can use reverberation as a cue to recognition. So this does contrast with speech because reverberation normally degrades speech recognition. But for example, if you're outdoors and you hear an explosion, hearing reverberation after the initial explosion will help you to know that it's a large event coming from far away. So in some cases, it could be a cue. There is evidence that our perceptual systems can merge both bottom-up information given by the acoustic stimulus and top-down information given by our knowledge of the world to infer an accurate interpretation of our sound environment. In this example, you'll listen to a recording that I made of the sound of water being poured from a pitcher into a cup. Next, I erased the sound in 5 brief spots. Then I filled in those gaps with white noise. So, the sound you're about to hear will be obscured midway through by 5 bursts of noise, and this waveform is depicted on the upper left side. You should perceive the water as being continuously poured with a smooth pitch throughout, regardless of the noise. I'll play it twice. Next, I will play it for you where I have removed the 5 bursts of noise, and you'll hear the remaining sound, which is really what was underneath the noise. This waveform is depicted on the upper right, and you can see that there's complete silence in the gaps. When I play it, you will hear the gaps and you will be under no illusion that the sound is continuous. In fact, you might imagine that the person pouring the water is rapidly wiggling the pitcher so as to start and stop the flow of water for a few times. Let's hear it. I'll play it a second time. So when there is noise, your mind fills in the missing signal with the smoothest continuity that it can get between the portions of the signal that you can hear. You hear the sound of pouring water, but it's not really there. That is your top-down auditory cognition at work. Research from my lab investigated the neural regions that are engaged when people are actively listening to sound events. While laying in an fMRI scanner, listeners heard 2 sounds and had to decide if they were the same or different. We recorded the sounds of both tapping and scraping actions. They were performed on both metal and plastic pipes. In the action block of trials, listeners were instructed to judge whether the action performed was the same, even if the material of the object differed. For example, I will play you the sound of a metal pipe scraping, and that will be followed by the sound of a metal pipe tapping. In this case, the listener would respond different because the actions differed. In contrast, in the material block, listeners were instructed to judge whether the material or the object was the same, regardless of the action performed. A listener in the material block would respond same to the pair of sounds that you already heard. Now, for clarification, I will play a pair of sounds with different materials, plastic and metal, but the same action, tapping. In this case, in the material block, a listener would respond different. Let me show you some of the results from that study. If you look at the yellow regions on these cortical maps, those are the regions that were more active when participants were discriminating those real sound events that you just heard in comparison to the control condition when they were listening to some spectrally matched noises. The yellow areas you see include the superior frontal gyrus in the frontal lobe and the inferior parietal sulcus in the parietal lobe. This shows that it's much more than an auditory task. So listening to sound events is not just recruiting auditory specific areas, but there are multimodal areas and top-down factors contributing to performance. Now we are going to talk about some of the acoustic features that we use to do everyday sound identification, and the causal information provided by sound comes in the form of acoustics. While there is no guarantee that the acoustics will be unique for every causal event, there is a causal connection between the acoustics and the event that produced it. I will describe some classes of spectrotemporal acoustic features that have been suggested by human data and acoustic analysis. And human accuracy for identifying materials, objects, and actions from sounds will be interpreted in this framework. We did a behavioral study in my lab about the identification of actions and materials. We used pipes again, and they were made of 4 different materials: glass, plastic, metal, and wood. And we performed 4 actions with them: bouncing, hitting, rolling, and scraping. We found that listeners could almost perfectly identify the actions. You can see that in the top graph. All the bars are high, regardless of the object or the condition. But when we ask people to identify material, we need to look at the lower graph. And there we can see that the dark gray bars do show some ability to tell metal and glass apart from wood and plastic. But if you want to know how well we can tell apart metal from glass, you'll have to look at these white bars down low. That's also where wood versus plastic is. We also note that the identification of material is best when you have impacts such as bouncing and hitting over here, relative to something like scraping or rolling over here. And note that most experiments in the literature that show good material discrimination by humans, they use impacts that are allowed to freely vibrate the objects, because that does provide the most information about material when resonant frequencies of an object are apparent. It's worth asking whether machine learning will be better at classifying materials than humans are. In another study, we tried to relate acoustic features to the different kinds of actions that were perceived in sounds. So we gave people 68 sounds to rate, and they got a scale in which they rated how likely it was that a sound was produced by a certain action. For example, they might hear the sound of a ball rolling and be asked how likely it was that the sound was produced by rolling. But we also asked how likely was it that the sound was produced by tapping or scraping, for a total of 18 ratings per sound. This allowed us to do a multidimensional analysis to put all of the sounds into a common space based on their similarity. The dimensions underlying this space mapped onto many commonly used acoustic features, such as the spectral centroid, modulation depth, etc. We found 6 main clusters of sounds. I've shown you 6 spectrograms of the sounds that were rated as the most typical sounds from each of these 6 groups. On the top left, we've got in panel A tapping sounds. They have 3 broadband onsets indicated by the vertical stripes, and some resonant frequencies indicated by the short horizontal stripes attached to each of them. On the top right in panel B, we have an explosion. Note that the intense broadband noise decays before there's an increase again due to reverberation. On the middle left in panel C, we have crumpling paper, and it has a mix of noisy events with varying bandwidths and timing. On the middle right in panel D, we have scraping, which has silence between the 3 broadband scrapes. And on the bottom left, panel E, we have a rolling ball, which has an emphasis in the low frequency region and shows the results of many small impacts between the rough surface of the wooden ball and the board on which it is rolling. And finally, on the bottom right, panel F, we see some dripping sounds. Several of the broadband transients are followed by a frequency modulated sweep. So, having established that people are sensitive to some aspects of the causal physics of sounds, it is important to consider this in the framework of what types of sound effects are physically possible. Following Gaver's analysis, we notice that with solids there can be impacts, scraping, deformation, and rolling. And with liquids there can be dripping, pouring, splashing, and rippling. And with gases there can be explosions, gusts, and continuous flow. A few thoughts about human labeling. First, I want to point out that there are some researchers who use environmental sounds as control conditions for words. They create a set of highly identifiable and stereotyped sounds that immediately suggest one unique name to associate with it. And this serves an important function for certain scientific questions. However, as a psychologist who studies hearing, I'm interested in much of what humans do with everyday sounds that is not as straightforward as that. Sometimes it's not clear what caused a sound. And perhaps learning about the ways in which humans deal with causal uncertainties could have value for sound event classification systems as well. Next, I'm going to tell you about some research we did in which we tried to figure out the best types of words and phrases to use to label action-oriented sounds. Believe it or not, we were asking this from the psychology point of view, not from the audio data set point of view. But first, I need to give you some background as to why we even thought to ask that question. And it's because Eleanor Roche did some research on taxonomies in which she showed that there is a best type of word to use to probe people's understanding. And for example, it's easy for someone to answer you if you ask them, is a robin a bird? That's easy, right? And you can answer that quickly. But if you ask someone, is a robin an animal? They'll get you an answer and they'll probably be right, but it's more difficult. And they do even make mistakes sometimes. So she took this as evidence that a term like bird is at a level of a taxonomy of living things that is the closest to a robin, whereas the term animal is more distant. It's at a higher level in the taxonomy, so it takes people less time and they're more accurate if you use these basic level terms. That is why we decided to ask a parallel question about whether there would be certain kinds of basic terms that would be the most fast and accurate for labeling action sounds. So we found some evidence for a best level for describing action sounds. On the left, you see a list of recorded sounds that we made, and we described them at various levels of detail and with different types of words, nouns, verbs, and adverbs. Many of these were what we might call action sounds, where a human is making an action with a fairly non-specific object. And again, like calling a robin an animal, it feels kind of odd to just be labeling a trickling sound as liquid. And so people do actually make mistakes on that question. And in the graph on the right, you can see in the bottom panel that response times were lowest when the basic level verb, such as trickling, was used. And responses were faster than using a higher level, more abstract verb like pouring, and they were faster than also water trickling without sacrificing any accuracy. Although the absolute highest accuracy, not significantly higher, was with the water trickling. So I realized that this result might on the surface seem to suggest that I'm saying a verb alone is better than a verb plus a noun. But just to be clear, that wasn't the point of this research. It was to find the most, fastest, most accurate way to label action sounds. But I think that consistently including both nouns and verbs is best in general, and that's the approach that is being taken by, say, the New York Sound Database by Bello et al. And others. I am providing this example of the verb taxonomy also to illustrate the importance of wording choices on listeners. So this particular insight also may help us to understand why certain words are being used preferentially by people when they are labeling sounds. Humans are flexible. They will categorize sounds along multiple dimensions. There are many possibilities, but here we will mention acoustic similarity and sound source similarity. On the one hand, two sound sources that seem very different, like a cat and an ambulance, may sound similar when they are wailing. On the other hand, a doorbell and a door knock may sound different, but they may sometimes be grouped together because they involve a door, which is a similar source. So we can get different similarity judgments and categorizations depending on how we ask people. And so I want to point out that you can't just ignore this issue and hope it goes away. People will pick some sort of a frame to answer these questions. So you're better off deciding what you want them to use and specifying it. This points out why it's very important to know what the instructions were whenever you use someone else's data. But given that what we do know so far, we should expect that the choice of label, such as a noun or a verb or a dimension like source or sound image, this ought to influence their listening mindset. This is a reason to be consistent when doing experiments and when getting labels. Also note, people can hear events in a gradual manner, so events that might be varying between different categories can still be heard and understood, and people can also remain undecided about what category a sound source was, and still they could infer some of its properties from the acoustics. These are all examples of people being pretty flexible in how they think about sounds, so you can decide if you think that's a strength or a weakness. There are many excellent free sound databases out there, and they all have different strengths. One thing they all must do is commit to how they will label and organize the sounds. As one example, the Auditory Labs Sound Events Database is a small database of action-oriented sounds, such as rolling balls and crumpling paper. The sounds are organized by event type rather than by object. It is small and specific, with its main advantage being that all sounds were recorded with the same high-quality audio equipment in a sound booth, and the recording conditions are well documented, including videos and specifications. But if you are looking for, instead, over 500,000 samples of every type of sound you could possibly need, you'll want to head over to Freesound. This is crowdsourcing at its best, with a large community of people uploading sounds under the Creative Commons license. Users will tag sounds with terms that they choose, like water or door, and also there are packs of sounds that include categories like zombie. No organization is imposed, so that one could search for objects or actions, but a quick look at the tags suggests that users tend toward using nouns in their tags. Contributors to Freesound are often very generous with information about the recording conditions, but it is not a requirement for any of the uploads, and some of the sounds are real recordings and others are synthetic. As one example of another type of database that you're no doubt very familiar with, I will mention the ESC50 database. It has 2,000 labeled environmental sounds organized into 50 classes, which have been very useful for benchmarking many methods of environmental sound classification. The classes are sometimes defined by a noun, such as dog, and sometimes by a noun plus a verb, such as glass breaking. Sometimes the class that is organized by a single source, such as a dog, contains vocalizations with a wide range of acoustic variation. And the higher level labels, such as animal sounds or interior domestic sounds, sometimes appeal both to sound sources and their environments. Please watch this movie carefully because it is difficult to see and it is very quick. Were you surprised? Okay, so the sound was me squeezing a box of cornstarch the whole time. That was a Foley effect. Back in the days of live radio broadcasts, sound effects were made to accompany stories that were being performed in a studio in real time. They had a small set of objects to work with and had to simulate the sounds of footsteps, rain, gunshots, etc. These types of sounds are called Foley effects after the man who originated many of them. By the way, nowadays, almost every environmental sound you hear in a movie is added in after the filming was done. It was not recorded along with the dialogue. There is someone who's paid to watch the movie and record themselves making all the sounds that should have been there, such as the squeak of a chair or the clink of a glass, and that's called a Foley artist. Anyway, the point is, there are some sounds that can be made by different objects or different processes, and they fool people regularly. It's informative to consider what properties allow these sound substitutions. As with sound event classification, there can be confusions between sounds from different causes and different categories. Many years ago, we set out to test whether Foley Effects could inform us about the important features for sound identification. We recorded pairs of real and Foley sound events, such as breaking glass, striking a match, or walking in mud. For example, for walking in mud, we recorded someone outside walking in mud, and we also had someone in the lab squishing a wet newspaper rhythmically with their hands. So in our experiment, we had participants listen to these recorded sounds and do a free response task to identify them. We coded this to get a quantitative accuracy score between 0 and 2 for the actions and for the materials of each sound. We are showing you the data for the material identification in this graph. We saw that just a couple of Foley sounds convey the material better than their real recording counterparts. If you look at the real and Foley pairs of striking a match and walking in mud towards the right in this graph, you'll see that material identification for the Foley sound, indicated by the yellow bars, was higher than it was for the real event, indicated by the blue bars. So we formed a hypothesis centered just on walking in mud. We thought that the real event had a better action, while the Foley event conveyed a better material of mud. So we formed a hypothesis about how to combine the best acoustic features of each of these sounds to make a hybrid sound that was better than the real one. So here's how we did that. On the left, you can see a description of how we extracted the temporal features of walking from the real recording. We bandpass filtered the signal and extracted the slow-moving temporal envelope represented in the plot as a blue line. From the Foley waveform, we edited out the silences and made one long squishing sound. We multiplied the envelope and the edited Foley sound to produce a hybrid sound, shown in the bottom right plot. First, I want to play the Foley sound for you. It sounds wet, but it doesn't convey footsteps very well. Next, I will play the hybrid version. In this version, it seems that the footsteps are very clear, as is the wetness. On the right-hand side of this slide, you will see data from a second experiment that we conducted with new listeners who listened to these stimuli in pairs. They were given two sounds in a forced choice task and asked which one was a more realistic example of walking in mud. In this graph, the hybrid sound is called mud apply, and the y-axis shows the proportion of times that participants preferred the hybrid sound. The majority of participants preferred the hybrid version over the Foley sound, and importantly, they also preferred it to the real recording. We can conclude in this example, where the original recording wasn't absolutely perfect, that the slow-moving temporal envelope that we used conveyed the most information about the action, whereas the fine structure in the waveform conveys the most information about the material. So why do Foley effects work? Traditional Foley effects don't seem to need to be acoustically identical to their real counterparts, but they seem to have features that they need to stand in for them. So why they work might be better understood by looking at these three levels of description of a sound. Let's consider the Foley sound of walking in snow. The first level of description on the top of this slide might describe the sensory or musical qualities of the sound of walking in snow, such as the fact that it seems noisy and periodic. Jumping down to the bottom level, we might go straight to identifying the source. Most people use this description if it's available to them. However, there is a middle level that I think explains why Foley effects work. In this case, cornstarch can fill in for snow because both events involved rhythmic compression of a granular substance. This level seems to express the physical interactions that produce similar acoustics. But who would describe a sound like this besides me? Well, perhaps a Foley artist, or maybe you will start to from now on. I would like to comment on the fact that there are many Foley synthesis methods out there. On the left-hand side of the slide, I'm showing you a recent paper that used a GAN to make sounds that match the actions in a movie. There are other methods out there that are using principles of physics to generate synthetic Foley, and these are really starting to close the gap between artificial sounds and real recorded ones. The dark side of all of that is shown on the right side. There's voice cloning that was used in a bank heist recently. It is possible that getting too good at imitating things can have its costs. I would like to venture into some implications for machine learning. Even though I'm a psychologist, I would like to pose some questions for you to consider. When machine learning is failing on a category, is there a way in which human perception or what we know about physics can help us to understand and improve performance? First of all, I want to point out that in general, exciting progress is being made in sound categorization by leveraging other modalities for supervision, such as language, images, and video. So maybe we can take that a step further. One factor to consider is that people can arrange sequences of small events into logical order, such as buttering toast and pouring coffee might imply making breakfast. This sequence could also be broken up into smaller events by other definitions. So the level of granularity is something to keep in mind, as it will surely affect the best strategy that will be successful in approaching this kind of sound classification and learning. Do you ever notice that some items in a category are consistently confused? Do you ever think that maybe there is a good reason and maybe they really shouldn't be in the same category? But your job is to predict the categories, so what can you do? Well, if so, maybe we can begin to understand some of this by using human judgments. For labeled data sets that are going to be used for benchmarking, could we use some of what we know to provide a more objective way to create or clean up database categories before we set our classification systems to try to learn from them? So for example, the same object can undergo different actions, as we've mentioned before. A door can creak or click shut or be knocked upon. And also ESC50 and other data sets tend to have mixed together two different types of airplanes into one class, both the jet and the propeller engines, which are acoustically pretty different. Also various types of alarms are very acoustically different. So this type of mixture may be making the learning task a lot harder if we're trying to predict sound event classes from acoustics. One question I want to ask is whether we can map action classes fairly directly onto acoustics, and if so, would it be helpful to first map acoustics to actions and subsequently map some set of actions onto various events or classes? And that is the topic of the next slide. So I did do some collaborative work on a classifier that actually improved its performance on classification of the ESC50 sound data set by considering actions. So we added 20 dimensions that described actions in these sound events. These action dimensions were described in terms of the basic types of verbs that I've already talked about, such as dripping and breaking and blowing and verbs like that, which did not by themselves identify the sound classes. So each sound was given a graded degree of multiple actions, and we called that an action vector. Each sound had that as a feature. And each row of the blue figure that you see here is an action vector for one of the 4 examples. This top row is for an airplane, and these columns indicate that it was rated high on blowing and rotating and vibrating. Of course, we had one unique action vector for each of the 2000 sounds. Our goal was to see if information about actions in the sounds in ESC50 could improve automatic sound event classification. As an example, one of our baseline systems used state-of-the-art audio embeddings to perform sound event classification. It was a deep neural network with 3 hidden layers and 6144 dimensions, which used audio embeddings from the OpenL3 network. It started out at 80.48% correct. Next, we stacked our 20-dimensional action vectors in this DNN, and we found that this improved sound event classification to 88% accuracy. One thing I should note is that although we'd like to generate these vectors automatically, at the start of this project we did not know how, so we had humans generate those action vectors. So this really is a proof of concept to show that this is useful. We also did experiments to show that it's not useful if the action vector is reduced to its single highest dimension, like just one action. Also, this approach loses its value if the ratings become all or none, so if we get rid of that graded nuance. Therefore, it seems that the graded multidimensional ratings of the action vectors are important, and we hope to find out more about that in the future. Continuing on with implications, I want to propose an idea for potentially a future DCASE challenge. This is going to come as a surprise to the organizers because I had the idea while I was preparing for this talk. It would be interesting to do a Foley challenge. The task would be to figure out which sound in a data set is a real recording of the event it claims to be and which is a fake version. There could be at least 3 different categories of fakes. The first could be a traditional Foley version, which is a real recording of a substituted action and object to mimic the original. The second type could be a synthesized fake, which makes use of current modeling techniques to generate sounds, either based on physical modeling or using videos of real events. And then a third type could be deep fakes that result from creating something as acoustically close to the target sound as possible via DNNs, etc. And this challenge overall might help researchers who want to use crowdsourced sound databases, if that could help them verify that the sounds are from real recordings, for example. It might also help improve synthetic generation of sounds. Finally, it might help with efforts to detect or foil audio deepfakes or other unwanted recording manipulations. That brings me to the end of my talk. I would like to thank members of the auditory lab and colleagues who contributed to the research that I discussed, and I look forward to speaking with members of the DCASE community after this talk.